What happened when the undercover CEO walked into his own company and discovered corruption, mistreatment, and fear controlling his employees? He didn't just watch, he took action. Employees were overworked, underpaid, and threatened into silence, all while their abusive manager manipulated schedules and stole wages. But this CEO wasn't about to let it slide. Disguised as a baggage handler, he saw firsthand how his workers suffered under toxic leadership. A supervisor who cut hours as punishment, ignored payroll complaints, and treated employees like they were disposable. But when the CEO uncovered the full extent of the abuse, he did what no one expected. He fired the corrupt manager on the spot and put real power back into the hands of his workers. This is a story about justice, leadership, and what happens when the people at the top finally listen to those at the bottom. Stay tuned to see how one decision changed everything for the employees at Terminal 6. If you love seeing bad bosses get what they deserve, make sure to watch until the end. Jonathan Carter sat in his corporate office staring at the latest employee satisfaction reports for Skyway Airlines. The numbers were worse than expected. Delays were piling up, passengers were furious about missing luggage, and employee turnover at Terminal 6 had reached an all-time high. Reports from the ground crew painted an alarming picture: overworked staff, unpaid overtime, and a toxic shift supervisor named Logan Reed. Employees described long hours with no breaks, arbitrary schedule changes, and a growing culture of fear and silence. Jonathan had always envisioned his airline as a company that valued its workforce, but it was clear that something had gone terribly wrong. The issue wasn't just about poor management, it was affecting the entire passenger experience. The airline's reputation was plummeting, and complaints about lost baggage and delayed flights were rising fast. When Jonathan questioned his regional managers, they assured him everything was under control, but he knew that was corporate speak for, "we don't want to deal with it." He had been too hands-off, trusting his middle managers to keep things running smoothly. That was a mistake. Determined to get to the root of the problem, Jonathan made a bold decision. He would go undercover as a new baggage handler at Terminal 6. With a worker's uniform, a neatly trimmed beard, and a slight change in posture, he could easily blend in. His executive ID and designer suit were traded for steel-tube boots and a name tag that read Ben Carter. No one in Terminal 6 had ever seen him in person, which made his disguise all the more believable. 2 days later, Jonathan arrived at the staff entrance of Terminal 6 under the cover of darkness. It was the start of the night shift, the busiest time for baggage handlers. The air was thick with the roar of jet engines, and the chaotic energy of the tarmac was almost overwhelming. Employees rushed back and forth, their faces tired, their bodies moving like machines rather than people. Logan Reed, the shift supervisor, barely glanced at him when he reported for duty, only muttering, "New guy, just don't slow anyone down." Jonathan adjusted his work gloves, exhaled, and stepped into the heart of the operation. He had come to find the truth, and he wasn't leaving until he did. As Jonathan stepped into the baggage handling area, the sheer intensity of the job hit him like a wall. The underground loading dock was hot, loud, and chaotic, filled with the constant hum of conveyor belts and the screeching of luggage carts. Workers moved in a frantic rhythm, lifting, sorting, and tossing bags, with barely a second to catch their breath. There was no room for error. One misplaced bag could mean a passenger stranded in another country without their belongings. Yet despite the importance of their job, the employees looked exhausted, detached, and overworked. Jonathan's first task was simple: stack incoming luggage onto a transport cart. But within minutes, his muscles were already aching. The weight of the bags was relentless, and the speed at which they had to move was inhuman. He stole quick glances at the others, trying to gauge the atmosphere. That's when he noticed Ava Mitchell, a senior baggage handler in her late 20s who worked with precision despite the fatigue evident in her posture. Her uniform was slightly wrinkled, her hair tucked into a loose ponytail, and her eyes carried the weight of too many sleepless nights. Unlike some of the others, she wasn't slacking or cutting corners. She was pushing through, no matter how drained she looked. Before Jonathan could introduce himself, a harsh voice cut through the air. "Move faster, people! We don't have all night!" Logan Reed, the shift supervisor, stomped into the loading dock, his arms crossed as he glared at the workers like a drill sergeant. When an older baggage handler hesitated while adjusting a cart, Logan stepped up to him and sneered. "If you can't keep up, maybe I should start cutting your hours." The worker said nothing, only bowing his head and working faster. Jonathan gritted his teeth. It wasn't just exhaustion weighing these people down, it was fear. Ava barely reacted to Logan's outburst, but Jonathan caught the way her shoulders tensed slightly, the way her hands gripped the luggage just a little tighter. No one here felt safe enough to push back. During a brief pause, Jonathan turned to Tyler, a ticketing agent who had been assigned to assist with overflow. "Is it always like this?" he asked in a low voice. Tyler let out a short, humorless laugh. "Welcome to Terminal 6, buddy. Keep your head down, do your job, and don't ask questions." Jonathan exhaled, adjusting his grip on the heavy suitcase in his hands. He had only been here for an hour, and already he could feel the weight of the problem pressing down on him. It didn't take long for Jonathan to see just how bad things really were at Terminal 6. By his second shift, the toxic atmosphere was undeniable. The ground crew moved like worn-out machines, their faces blank, their bodies sluggish from exhaustion. Employees barely spoke to one another, and when they did, their voices were hushed, as if afraid of being overheard. The moment their supervisor, Logan Reed, entered the room, the energy shifted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and everyone immediately picked up their pace, trying to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Jonathan was stacking luggage near the conveyor belt when he heard Logan's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Ava, get over here!" His tone was sharp, impatient. Jonathan turned his head just in time to see Ava freeze, her hand tightening around the handle of a suitcase before she forced herself to step forward. Logan gestured to a pile of untagged luggage near the loading dock. "This is your section." Ava opened her mouth to explain, but hesitated. I haven't gotten to that yet. We were backed up from—" "I don't want excuses." Logan cut her off immediately, his voice rising. "Just do your damn job. I'm not paying you to stand around." Jonathan watched as Ava swallowed hard, nodding quickly before rushing over to fix the mess. Her hands shook slightly as she grabbed the first suitcase, her jaw clenched tight. She didn't argue. She didn't even defend herself. She just obeyed. Logan, satisfied with her submission, turned and walked away without another word. Jonathan could feel his anger boiling beneath the surface. He had run a company long enough to know the difference between discipline and outright abuse. Logan wasn't managing, he was ruling through intimidation. Later, during their rushed break, Jonathan sat down across from Ava in the cramped break room. She barely acknowledged him at first, staring at her phone with tired, unfocused eyes. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She let out a humorless chuckle, shaking her head. "No one's okay here. We just survive." Before Jonathan could push further, Tyler passed by and muttered under his breath, "Don't get involved, man. You push too hard and you'll lose hours, maybe even your job." Jonathan tightened his grip on his water bottle. He had seen enough to know that this wasn't just bad management. This was outright exploitation. Employees were too scared to speak up, and Logan thrived on that fear. But Jonathan wasn't afraid. He had come here to find the truth, and now he had it. It was time to act. Jonathan knew he needed more than just witnessing the abuse. He needed concrete evidence. That night, after his shift ended, he stepped outside and made a discreet call to his corporate finance team. "I need payroll records for Terminal 6, he said, keeping his voice steady, "and I need them now." Within minutes, the documents arrived in his inbox. As Jonathan scanned through them, his stomach tightened with anger. The records told a story far worse than he expected. Dozens of employees were being systematically underpaid, their hours cut just below the threshold for overtime and benefits. Some, like Ava, were working 60-plus hours a week but only getting paid for 40. Others were clocking in for split shifts but never being compensated for their full time. Jonathan clenched his jaw. This wasn't a clerical error or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate wage theft. The next day, Jonathan returned to work with renewed focus, determined to confirm what he had seen in the records. He started subtly asking questions, pretending to be a concerned new hire. "Hey, Ava," he said while loading luggage onto the conveyor belt. "I heard some guys saying their paychecks were short last week. That ever happened to you?" Ava hesitated for a second, her expression guarded. "It happens," she said finally, avoiding his gaze. "Payroll messes up sometimes. Logan says it gets fixed, but—" She trailed off, shaking her head. Jonathan noticed the way her fingers tightened around the handle of a suitcase as she spoke, as if she wanted to say more but knew better. Fear. It was everywhere in this place. Later, in the break room, Jonathan overheard Tyler talking in hushed tones with another worker. "I checked my pay stubs," Tyler muttered. "I worked 48 hours last week, but the system says 39. That's almost $100 missing." Jonathan made a mental note. Tyler's case matched the payroll records he had seen. Logan wasn't just cutting hours. He was manipulating the system to keep wages low, while still demanding full labor output. As Jonathan put the final pieces together, he realized one thing. He had enough proof to confront Logan directly. He wasn't just dealing with a bad supervisor. He was dealing with someone who was actively stealing from his employees. The next step was clear. Logan had to go, and Jonathan would make sure it happened before another paycheck was stolen. The next evening, Jonathan walked into Terminal 6, but this time, he wasn't just Ben the baggage handler. He was Jonathan Carter, the CEO of Skyway Airlines. Word spread through the terminal like wildfire as employees noticed his presence. Workers who had been rushing to meet flight deadlines froze mid-step, exchanging uncertain glances. Logan, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere, was leaning against a baggage cart, scrolling through his phone. When he finally looked up, his smirk faltered for the first time. Jonathan strode toward him with calm authority, stopping just inches away. "We need to talk, now." His voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. Logan's eyes darted around, realizing that every employee nearby was watching. He hesitated before giving a tight nod and leading Jonathan into the supervisor's office. The moment the door closed, Jonathan didn't waste time. He pulled out his printed payroll reports and slammed them onto the desk. "I've reviewed the numbers," he said coolly. "You've been manipulating payroll, cutting hours, and underpaying employees for months." Logan's jaw tightened, but Jonathan didn't stop. "You've been forcing people to work off the clock, threatening them with fewer shifts if they speak up, and creating a workplace built on fear." Logan scoffed, crossing his arms. "If there were payroll mistakes, that's an issue for HR," he said dismissively. "Not my fault if some people don't know how to check their pay stubs." Jonathan's expression didn't change. "This isn't a mistake. It's a pattern." He took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough to make Logan feel the full weight of his authority. "And it stops today." Logan shifted uncomfortably but tried to regain control. "Look, I run this terminal the way I see fit. If I have to manage hours to stay within budget, that's just business." Jonathan narrowed his eyes. "Business doesn't mean exploiting employees." Logan scoffed again. "They should be grateful they have jobs. You think someone like Ava is going to find better? She's barely holding it together as it is." Jonathan's hands curled into fists. That was it. "You're done here, Logan. You're fired." For a moment, silence filled the room. Logan's face darkened, but the finality in Jonathan's voice was unmistakable. He let out a sharp breath, shaking his head as he shoved past Jonathan and yanked open the door. Employees outside pretended not to have been listening, but the tension in the air was electric. Jonathan stepped out after him and addressed the gathered staff. "If anyone has concerns about their pay, come to me directly. You will be compensated for what you're owed." The shift in the room was almost palpable. For the first time, Jonathan saw relief in his employees' faces. But he wasn't done yet. It was time to rebuild the right way. As Logan stormed out of Terminal 6 for the last time, a hushed silence hung in the air. The baggage handlers, ticketing agents, and ground crew all stood frozen, processing what had just happened. For the first time in a long time, there was no Logan barking orders, no threats of cut hours, no fear of retaliation. The weight of his control had been lifted. Jonathan turned to face the employees, his tone softer now, but still firm. "No one here should have to choose between keeping their job and being treated with basic fairness," he said. "Starting today, every employee will be paid for every hour worked, and payroll will be audited to make sure this never happens again." Ava, who had been standing near the baggage carts, met Jonathan's gaze, uncertainty flickering in her tired eyes. He knew she had been one of the hardest-working employees here, and yet she had suffered the most under Logan's rule. That needed to change. "I'll be bringing in a new shift supervisor," Jonathan continued, "but before I do, I want to offer the job to someone who already knows this terminal inside and out." He turned to Ava. "Would you take the role?" A ripple of shock moved through the staff. Ava's eyes widened. "Me?" she said, shaking her head slightly. I don't have management experience." Jonathan smiled. "You've already been doing more than your fair share of the work. You stepped up when no one else would. That's what leadership is." For a moment, Ava hesitated. She had spent so long just trying to survive, she had never imagined herself in a position of authority, but when she glanced around at her coworkers, many of whom now looked at her with newfound respect, she exhaled, nodding. "I'll do it." A few employees let out quiet cheers, while others exchanged relieved glances. The tension in the room had shifted. There was still work to do. Trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight, but for the first time, hope was returning to Terminal 6. As Jonathan left that night, he knew that this was just the beginning. He had come undercover to find the truth, and now he was staying to make things right. The story of Jonathan Carter's undercover experience at Terminal 6 highlights a critical lesson about leadership, accountability, and workplace fairness. As a CEO, Jonathan had assumed that his company was running smoothly, but by stepping into the shoes of his employees, he uncovered a harsh reality: exploitation, fear, and systemic abuse. The biggest lesson here is that leaders cannot lead effectively from a distance. True leadership requires direct involvement, listening to employees, and ensuring fair treatment at all levels. Another key takeaway is that toxic management destroys morale, productivity, and trust. Logan's intimidation tactics and unethical payroll practices not only harmed employees, but also damaged customer service and the company's reputation. It took Jonathan's intervention to correct the system, but the real success came when he empowered the right people, like Ava, to step up and lead. Finally, the story reminds us that fair treatment in the workplace isn't a privilege, it's a right. Employees should not have to fear speaking up about mistreatment, and companies should prioritize their well-being. A business thrives when its employees feel valued, respected, and heard. In the end, real change happens when leaders take responsibility and take action.